My name is Nora Bennett, and this is not the story I thought I'd be telling. When my grandfather died, I thought I knew what grief would feel like. I thought it would come in quiet waves. Like the hush that settles after the last notes of a song, I imagined the whole family gathering in his memory together in our shared loss, our arms around one another, remembering him in the warmth of a home he built and the love he tried to leave behind instead. I got a message, short, cruel, from my cousin of all people, just 8 words: "Sorry, Nora. This is more of a private event." Private, as if I wasn't family, as if I hadn't spent the last year by his bedside, holding his hand while machines hummed beside him and his body failed him day by day, as if I hadn't read him his favorite poems until he fell asleep, whispered his old jokes back to him just to see him smile, as if I hadn't been there when no one else could be bothered to show up. But grief doesn't just hurt because someone dies, it hurts because of the silences that follow, the way people leave you behind when you need them most. My aunt texted me after, just to twist the knife a little deeper. She said, "You know, Grandpa barely knew you, sweetheart. We just didn't want to complicate things." And my uncle, he chimed in with a laugh emoji, like this was all some light-hearted misunderstanding. "We're keeping it simple, immediate family only." I don't know if anything has ever made me feel so invisible. And my mother, she didn't say anything at all. I waited for hours for a call, a message, something. I scrolled through our thread until my thumb ached, watching the last text from her blink at me like a taunt. "Call you tomorrow." That was 4 days ago. She didn't even say his name. It was like Grandpa had disappeared from the world, and so had I. The truth is, I didn't always used to be close to him. As a kid, he felt more like a distant mountain than a man, strong, unyielding, and a little out of reach. My parents rarely took us to visit, and when they did, they stayed just long enough for appearances. I learned to sit still and not ask too many questions. I never thought he saw me, but all of that changed last year when he got sick. I went to see him out of obligation at first, a quick visit, a check-in. I didn't expect anything, but he smiled when he saw me, really smiled. "You're taller than I remember," he said, and quieter. "That's a rare combination." I laughed, and something softened between us. That day, I stayed longer than I meant to. He asked me about school, about books, about my favorite kind of music. He told me stories I'd never heard about his first job, the war, the way he met my grandmother, how much he missed her. His voice cracked when he said her name. I sat beside him and listened like it was sacred scripture. Maybe it was. So I came back the next day, and the next. And then it wasn't just once a week, it was daily. We built a quiet little world of our own inside that hospice room. We didn't talk about death, we just existed together, shared meals, watched old movies, took short walks when he had the strength. I became the person who made sure he had clean socks and comfortable pillows, and someone to talk to when the nights were too long. He never asked me for anything. He just smiled when I walked in, like I was a gift he hadn't expected but was grateful to receive. One night, the rain wouldn't stop. It poured against the windows like it had a score to settle with the earth. The room was dim. Grandpa looked small in his bed, tucked under layers of blankets, skin pale and thin like paper. I thought he was asleep, so I sat by the window and read quietly. "Nora," he said suddenly, voice rough and low. I turned. His eyes were wide open, watching me. He reached out a trembling hand. I went to him, took it gently. "I want you to remember something," he said. "I've made sure they won't forget you again." I didn't understand what he meant then. I thought it was just the morphine, or a fever dream, or maybe a final blessing from a man who saw me more clearly than anyone else in that family ever had. I nodded. "Okay," I whispered, tears stinging the corners of my eyes. "I promise." He smiled, that rare, real smile I'd come to love. Then he closed his eyes. 2 days later, he was gone. And now here I was, not even allowed to sit in a pew and say goodbye. No mention of me in the family group texts, no invitation to the dinner, no seat at the table, not even a call from the woman who gave birth to me. They wanted to erase me, pretend I hadn't mattered, pretend I hadn't loved him the way they hadn't bothered to, pretend that my grief wasn't real because it wasn't convenient for them to acknowledge it. But grief is not polite, it does not wait for permission. And I wasn't going to be quiet anymore. I found out through a text, not from my mother, not from my aunt, not even from the lawyer who eventually handled the will. It came from my cousin Lindsay, the one who used to braid my hair at sleepovers and share secrets under the covers when we were 12. the one who once cried when I moved away in middle school and promised we'd always be best friends. Even if our parents stopped talking, sorry, Nora, the message said, plain as bone. This is more of a private event, just close family. That was it. No explanation, no apology, not really. Just a cold little bullet of rejection fired into my phone screen while I sat in the parking lot of the hospice, hands still shaking from signing the release forms. Grandpa's body had been taken away not even 2 hours earlier. I remember staring at those words over and over again, waiting for more to come. And I'm so sorry. I didn't mean it like that, or you should still come, or even just I know he loved you. But there was nothing, just silence, and then, before I could respond, I saw the pictures on Instagram, of course, filtered, and smiling. The family posed beneath the floral arch at the private memorial, my mother in a pale blue dress I'd never seen before, her hair done in soft curls that looked like she cared. My uncle, beaming, holding a glass of wine, Lindsay in black, captioning her post saying goodbye to the greatest man we've ever known, no mention of me. No trace that I had sat beside that same man just days earlier and watched his chest rise and fall with effort, that I had wiped the sweat from his forehead when the pain spiked, that I had kissed his hand when his eyes finally fluttered closed for the last time. They pretended I didn't exist. I didn't know what hurt more, being excluded, or the casualness of it. Like I was a footnote they decided to delete. I texted my mother one message, why wasn't I invited? She didn't reply. I waited for an hour, then called straight to voicemail. Eventually, a response came, not from her directly, but from her assistant. A woman I'd never met. Hi Nora, your mom is unavailable this week but sends her love. She asked me to remind you that the service was for immediate family only. She hopes you're doing okay. Doing okay. My heart cracked so loudly in my chest it felt like the whole world should have heard it. Immediate family. As if I wasn't her daughter. As if I hadn't come from her body. As if Grandpa's love for me had to be measured in proximity and bloodlines, not memories and kindness. But the thing is, I wasn't surprised. It hurt, but I wasn't shocked. My mother and I had been drifting for years, ever since she remarried and started treating me like a souvenir from a past life she was trying to forget. She smiled at me in public, nodded when I told stories, but never really looked at me, not the way Grandpa did, not with curiosity, not with warmth, just a kind of polite boredom. And now, with Grandpa gone, it was like she'd finally found the excuse she needed to erase me entirely. I sat in my tiny apartment that night and didn't cry. I wanted to. The tears were there, hot and swollen behind my eyes, but something inside me had locked up. It was like my grief had been replaced by this hard, metallic anger, not loud, not dramatic. Just steady, quiet burning. I thought about Grandpa, about how he used to squeeze my hand 3 times, a secret way of saying I love you, how he'd ask me to bring his favorite shortbread cookies even when the doctor said no, and then hide them in his nightstand drawer, like a kid breaking the rules. He never said I wasn't family. He never made me feel small. In fact, the last time I saw him fully lucid, he reached up, touched my cheek, and said, "You're the only one who stayed." And I stayed through the long days and the lonely nights, through the pain and the fear and the stories he was afraid he'd never get to tell. I stayed when everyone else made excuses, work, traveled too hard to see him like that. I saw him like that, and I still loved him. So no curated photo, no brunch buffet with a slideshow, no eulogy full of half-truths was going to erase what we had. I didn't need their permission to mourn him, and I didn't need their approval to matter. Still, there was one thing I couldn't stop thinking about. That night, the rainy one, just a few days before he died, when he'd taken my hand and looked me in the eyes. "I've made sure they won't forget you again," he'd said. I didn't know what that meant. Not then, but the words had been sitting heavy in my chest like a stone ever since. And now, with every cold shoulder and every fake smile from the people who claimed to love him, I started to understand. He'd known somehow. He had known this would happen, and he'd prepared for it. When I finally got my aunt on the phone, she sounded bored. I'd called 3 times before she picked up, and even then it felt like she only answered out of obligation. I could hear dishes clinking in the background, distant laughter, the hum of conversation, somewhere in her house. The rest of the family was gathering, maybe reminiscing about Grandpa. Maybe just enjoying a catered meal and pretending everything was fine. "Nora," she said, her voice drawn out like a sigh, I really wish you wouldn't make this more difficult than it has to be. I didn't know what to say, my mouth opened, but nothing came out. I was stunned into silence by the sheer audacity of it all. She took my pause as an invitation to continue. This was a very emotional time for everyone, you know. We didn't want drama. We just wanted something small, simple, respectful, small. I repeated quietly. Double quotes, yes, just close family. She hesitated, then added, and I know you and your grandfather had your little visits, but he didn't really, well, he barely knew you. The words hit like a slap. He barely knew you. How do you even begin to explain what it means to be known by someone not through shared holidays or group photos, but in the way someone remembers how you take your tea, or which chapter of your favorite book makes you cry every time? He knew me, I said, my voice low and trembling. Oh, Nora, she replied in that patronizing way she always did when I was a kid. Look, I'm not trying to hurt you. It's just that you weren't around growing up. You weren't really part of the family's rhythm, like I was offbeat, a wrong note, a guest appearance in a long-running show. He asked for me, I said suddenly, anger starting to simmer in my chest. When he was in hospice, I was there almost every day. You weren't, she paused. Well, we all had things going on, right? Things, dinners, vacations, spa days. I was there when he was too weak to sit up. I continued, the words tumbling out before I could stop them. I was the one who read to him when he couldn't sleep. I was the one who called the nurse when he couldn't breathe. Nora, she interrupted sharply. Don't make this about proving something. I blinked. What? He's gone now, and we all have to deal with that loss in our own way. If you're trying to claim him for yourself, it's not fair to the rest of us. Claim him. I wasn't claiming him. I wasn't waving a flag or carving my name into his headstone. I was just trying to hold on to what little I had left, a connection that none of them had cared about until it was time to distribute it, divide it, shape it into something that suited their version of the story. And now I was being accused of making a scene. You're grieving, she said after a pause, and I get it, but don't turn this into some kind of performance. A performance? That's what they thought this was. They hadn't seen the way Grandpa smiled when I brought him fresh-baked bread from the little bakery near my apartment. They didn't hear him laugh when I teased him about his ancient slippers, or how he held my hand and said he wished he'd gotten more time with me. They didn't want to see it, because if they did, they'd have to admit that maybe they'd failed him, that maybe the girl they'd pushed to the margins had been the only one who really showed up when it counted. When the call ended, I sat in the dark for a long time. No music, no television, just me and the ache in my chest. My uncle called the next morning, and I didn't answer. He left a voicemail instead, casual and upbeat, like he was calling about a barbecue. Hey Nora, sorry things got messy. Your aunt told me you were upset. Just wanted to say no hard feelings. Okay, we didn't mean to hurt you. It was just easier to keep things small. Grandpa wouldn't have wanted a big fuss, no fuss. As if grief is only valid when it's neat and quiet, as if love should be measured in convenience. I deleted the message. Later, I heard through an old family friend that my mother had told people I was overreacting, that I'd grown distant over the years and was just looking for attention. That was when the numbness began to wear off. In its place came something colder, sharper, not hatred, not even bitterness. Just clarity. They weren't confused. They weren't clumsy or forgetful. They had deliberately chosen to erase me, to cut me out. And when I didn't vanish quietly, they labeled me difficult, dramatic, a problem. But Grandpa had seen through all that, somehow, through everything. He had seen me, and in the last year of his life, he chose me not because I was convenient, or presentable, or easy to explain, but because I stayed, because I cared, and deep down, I think they knew that. That's why they shut the door so quickly, because my presence at that service would have forced them to see the gap between who they were pretending to be and who he really loved. Asterisk, that was their choice. And soon I'd find out what his had been. People talk about grief like it's loud, like it arrives with sobs and shattered glasses, storming through your chest and leaving destruction in its wake. But for me, it was quiet. It moved in like fog, soft and heavy, and it stayed. In the days after Grandpa passed, I found myself remembering things without meaning to. A cup of chamomile tea would send me back to that corner room in the hospice, where the air always smelled faintly of antiseptic and wilted carnations. I'd close my eyes and see him there, propped up by pillows, his breath shallow but steady, his eyes soft when they landed on me. You again, he'd whisper, smiling like I was the best surprise he could imagine. I started keeping a notebook. I didn't even realize I was doing it at first. I just needed a place to keep it all, like, if I didn't write these pieces down, they'd slip away and I'd lose him for real. So I filled pages with the small things, the way his voice sounded just before he fell asleep, the slight tremble in his hand when he reached for mine, the lopsided grin he'd give me when I smuggled in his favorite cookies against the nurse's orders. I remembered how he once asked me to find an old radio drama he loved as a boy. I tracked it down online, burned it to a CD, and brought in a cheap little player so he could listen. He cried the first time he heard it. Just sat there, tears slipping down his cheeks, staring out the window like he was seeing his whole life play out in those tinny voices and crackling static. That, he whispered, is what the world sounded like when I still believed anything was possible. It was moments like that, small, quiet, sacred, that built the bond between us. Not grand gestures, not family functions or holiday cards, just consistency, presence. The kind of love that doesn't ask for anything in return. I never expected it to mean so much. I didn't go into those visits looking for anything at first. I just didn't want him to be alone. I knew what that felt like. I knew what it meant to sit in a room and wait for someone who never showed up. I couldn't do that to him. So I became the one who stayed. When the pain got worse, and the doctors started speaking in low voices and euphemisms, I held his hand and read to him anyway. When he couldn't eat solid food, I brought warm broth in a thermos and fed it to him in slow, careful spoonfuls. I called the nurses when he needed more meds. I charged his phone when he forgot. I even learned how to shave his face gently so he wouldn't feel so unkempt. Once, after a rough night, he looked at me and said, "You're too young for this." I laughed. Too young for what? Soup and crossword puzzles. He shook his head. Too young to carry this kind of weight, asterisk asterisk, but I didn't mind, not really. Because in that space, those late nights and early mornings, those quiet afternoons when the world felt paused, I got to know the man behind the grandfather. The stubborn, complicated, funny, kind man who had regrets and secrets and stories no one else ever bothered to ask about. He told me things he never told anyone, about how he hated the corporate job he held for 30 years but stayed because he had mouths to feed, about the affair he never acted on but thought about for years, about the night he stood alone in the delivery room while my grandmother gave birth to my mother, how terrified he'd been, how proud I wasn't always a good father. He said once, eyes unfocused, like he was talking to the ceiling, but I tried to be better near the end. I tried to show up, and he did. In those final months, he showed up for me in ways no one else in our family ever had. He listened, he remembered, he saw me. The others, my aunt, my uncle, even my mother, they were all so preoccupied with managing the image of him, talking about his legacy, the family name, the estate. I doubt they ever asked him how he felt. I doubt they even noticed when his hands started to shake or when the light dimmed behind his eyes, but I did. I saw it all. Every decline, every spark of joy, every moment of fear on surrender. And I never turned away. Sometimes, when I'd sit by his bed and the world outside that window felt impossibly far away, I'd think about what it meant to be family, if blood was enough, if tradition was enough, and every time I came back to the same truth: family isn't who you're born to, it's who holds your hand when your world is falling apart. I didn't care what anyone said. I knew what we had was real. I knew it in the way he squeezed my fingers when he was too tired to speak. I knew it in the way he kept a picture of me in his drawer, even when his memory began to fray. I knew it in the way he trusted me with his fears, his hopes, his stories. And I began to wonder, what if those memories were the real inheritance? What if everything else, the house, the money, the antiques, was just noise compared to the love we built in those last fragile months? But then I remembered what he said that rainy night, his voice, so soft I barely heard it. "I've made sure they won't forget you again." At the time, I thought he meant the memories, that maybe he'd written something down, a letter, perhaps a note in his journal. But the way he said it, the certainty in his voice, it was more than that. He had done something they weren't expecting. And soon I'd find out what it was. The rain had been falling all day. It wasn't the soft, rhythmic kind that makes you want to stay in bed. It was heavy, relentless, pounding against the windows like it was trying to break in. I remember that night so clearly, it feels like it just happened. Every detail is burned into my mind. The creak of the hallway linoleum beneath my shoes, the faint buzz of the fluorescent lights overhead, the way the air in Grandpa's room was warmer than usual, thick with the scent of flowers that someone had left on the windowsill and a kind of metallic stillness I couldn't explain. He looked smaller that evening, not just physically, though he was thinner than ever. Swallowed up by the blankets and pillows, he looked farther away, like some part of him had already begun to let go, even though his chest still rose and fell in that slow, labored rhythm. I pulled the chair close to his bedside and sat down. Holding a book in my lap I didn't have the heart to read. The rain kept hammering the roof above us, drowning out the quiet beeps of the monitors. He opened his eyes and turned to me. I didn't realize how much effort that took until I saw the exhaustion in his face afterward. As if just lifting his head had cost him more than he could afford to spend. But he did it anyway for me, Nora, he said. My name on his lips sounded softer than ever, like a prayer. I'm here, I whispered, reaching for his hand. His fingers were cold, bones under skin. But they curled around mine, weak but deliberate. He held on, and I could feel it, everything he didn't have the strength to say all at once, pressing into that touch. I need you to remember something, he said, breath hitching between syllables. It matters, okay. I leaned in, trying to hear every word, trying to keep my voice steady even as my throat tightened. I'm listening. He took a breath, slow and careful. I've made sure they won't forget you again. I didn't know what to say. My heart thudded in my chest, and I squeezed his hand gently. What do you mean? But he didn't answer right away. His eyes fluttered closed for a moment, like the effort of speaking had pulled him toward sleep. I thought he was gone, just resting, but then his hand tightened, just slightly, and he opened them again. I see you, he said. I saw everything. Tears welled in my eyes before I could stop them. I love you, I whispered. His mouth lifted in the smallest smile. I know. Those were the last words he ever spoke to me. I stayed with him until the nurse came to check his vitals. Even then, I didn't want to let go of his hand. I remember staring at the rain beyond the window and thinking about how many nights I'd spent in that chair. How many hours we'd passed in silence or laughter or quiet conversation. And now the room felt like it was folding in on itself, too empty already, even though he was still breathing beside me. I made a vow to him that night, not out loud, not in some dramatic way, but deep inside. In that part of me that had carried him through every painful day and every quiet victory, I promised him I would not let them erase me. I would not shrink myself to make them comfortable. I would not disappear because they wanted me to. He had seen me, really seen me. Not as some afterthought, not as a disappointment, not as someone too quiet or too sensitive or too strange. He had seen my love. He had felt it. And he had given it back to me in those final days with more honesty than anyone else in my life ever had. That mattered, and I would carry it with me even when it hurt, even when they made me feel like a stranger in my own family, even when they gathered without me and shared stories as if I hadn't been there, as if I didn't exist. I left the hospice that night with soaked shoes, a soaked coat, and a soaked soul. I walked the 2 blocks to my car because I needed the air, even if it came in the form of cold wind and biting rain. I sat behind the wheel and cried for a long time, not because I was broken, not because I was lost, but because I had loved him so deeply, and he had known, and that was both beautiful and unbearably painful. The next morning, the sun came out. It didn't feel fair. The world should have stayed gray a little longer, but there it was, blinding and indifferent. The phone calls started soon after, the logistics, the arrangements, the silences from people who should have reached out but didn't. I stayed quiet, not because I had nothing to say, but because I was holding something sacred, a promise, memory, a piece of him that they couldn't touch no matter how hard they tried. I didn't know what he meant that night. I didn't know what he'd done, but I believed him, with every beat of my heart. I believed him. He had made sure I would not be forgotten. And when the letter from the attorney arrived a few days later, inviting me to a formal will-reading one, none of them had told me about. My hands shook as I held the envelope. I heard his voice again, clear as if he were sitting beside me. I've made sure. He had left me something, and I was about to find out what. I wasn't supposed to see the pictures. But the thing about people like my family, image obsessed, self-satisfied, so certain they're untouchable, is that they can't help themselves. They have to post. They have to show the world how gracious they are, how close-knit, how elegant their grief looks under soft lighting and flattering angles. So I saw the ceremony, not in person. Of course my invitation had been swallowed in silence, but on Lindsay's social media feed, a collage of filtered snapshots under the caption, "Goodbye to a great man, a private celebration of life. We love you, Grandpa." They'd rented the same winery where my aunt had once thrown her anniversary party. Rows of chairs on polished wood floors. A string quartet. White hydrangeas in tall vases. Candles arranged in tidy circles around black and white photographs of Grandpa in his younger years posed, distant, formal, a version of him that hadn't existed in decades. And there they were, all of them, dressed like it was a magazine shoot. My uncle in his tailored suit, my aunt clutching a tissue as she smiled for the camera, my mother standing off to the side with her perfect posture and her perfect expression, composed and touched. I wasn't surprised to be left out, but I didn't expect it to feel like this. It was one thing to be forgotten. It was another thing to be rewritten. Because in those posts, in those carefully worded captions and curated images, there was no trace of the man I had known, no mention of his final year, no glimpse of the hospice room, or the walks in the garden, or the pain he endured with quiet dignity. Just the polished version they preferred, the one who'd been distant enough for them to mold into whatever memory they needed. I wasn't even mentioned, not once. It was as if I hadn't been there at all. And maybe that's what stung the most, not the exclusion, but the erasure, the way they'd scooped out the truth and filled it with the pieces that made them look good. Like grief was a stage, and they were actors reciting lines they barely understood. I should have been furious, part of me was, but mostly, I just felt hollow. Like I was watching my own life from a distance, unable to reach out and reclaim what had been taken. I didn't say anything, not to them, not yet. Instead, I went to the hospice. It was a strange thing to do, I guess, but I needed to be somewhere that still felt real. I brought a single flower white freesia, his favorite, and walked the familiar halls, nodding at the nurses who remembered me, who offered gentle smiles and soft condolences that meant more than any family tribute ever. Cold. I sat on the bench, outside his old room. The bed had already been stripped, the walls bare. Someone else would be moving in soon. Life would continue. But I closed my eyes and pictured him there, his voice, his laugh, the way his eyes crinkled when I read something funny, and I let myself cry, really cry. Not the quiet tears I'd swallowed for days, but the kind that shook through me and left my ribs aching. I didn't cry for him, though. I cried for me, for the girl who had shown up, who had loved deeply, who had done everything right and still been told she didn't belong. That night, I didn't open the letter from the lawyer right away. I left it on the counter unopened for hours, I think. I was afraid that maybe this, too, would be a final exclusion, that the promise he'd made in that hospital bed had been a kindness, not a plan, that I'd show up at the will reading and find nothing waiting for me. But when I finally slit the envelope open, the words were plain and direct. You are cordially invited to the reading of the last will and testament of Harold Bennett to be held at the offices of Carson and Drew, Thursday at 10 o'clock a.m. All listed beneficiaries are encouraged to attend. Listed. Beneficiaries. I read the words over and over. I felt something stir in me then, not hope, exactly, but something close, a flicker of recognition, a whisper that maybe, just maybe, I hadn't imagined it. That when he said, I've made sure they won't forget you, he meant more than memory. I didn't tell anyone I was going. There was no point. If they knew, they'd find a way to stop me, or worse, they'd try to pretend it was a mistake, that I had misunderstood the invitation, that I was intruding again. But I wasn't. I belonged there. I was tired of shrinking myself to fit into their version of the story, tired of being the outsider, the afterthought, the girl who loved too quietly to matter. I picked out a simple black dress and ironed it carefully. I packed the notebook I'd been keeping, the one filled with his stories and our memories, and tucked it into my bag like armor, not because I needed proof, but because it reminded me that I was real, that what we had was real. And the morning of the reading, I stood in front of the mirror and looked myself in the eyes. You are not small, I whispered. You are not invisible. He saw me. And soon. So would they. The office was nothing like I expected. I'd imagined something cold and sterile, shiny floors, impersonal lighting, a receptionist with a headset and a tight-lipped smile. But Carson and Drew felt more like a library than a law firm. The floors were dark wood, scuffed in places, and the walls were lined with shelves filled with thick leather-bound volumes, old case files, maybe. Or just the kind of books meant to give the illusion of gravitas. It smelled faintly of dust and citrus oil, a place where decisions had been made for generations, most of them behind closed doors. I was early, 15 minutes to be exact. I sat in the waiting room clutching my coat in my lap, feeling the anxiety twist tighter in my chest with each tick of the old grandfather clock in the corner. Every time the door creaked, I braced for the sound of someone saying I didn't belong, that there had been a mistake, that this invitation wasn't meant for me, but no one said anything. The receptionist glanced up once, offered a polite nod, then went back to her typing. I didn't recognize the man who came to get me, but he introduced himself as Mr. Carson, and I recognized the name from the letter. He was in his 60s, with soft eyes and a voice like gravel smoothed by years of manners. "Thank you for coming, Miss Bennet," he said. "Of course," I replied. Though my voice came out thinner than I wanted, he led me down a narrow hallway, to a conference room with a long table and a pitcher of water that no one had touched. I was the first one there. That didn't surprise me. I stood by the window, staring down at the street below. People walking quickly in coats, a delivery truck, double parked near a cafe. The city moved on, unaware that in this quiet room above it, someone's last wishes were about to be spoken into the world. Eventually, the others arrived. My aunt walked in first, her heels tapping sharply against the floor, followed by my uncle and his wife. Then came Lindsay, flanked by her younger brother like she needed protection. They all froze when they saw me. There was a pause so small and yet so seismic where the air between us thickened with confusion, then contempt. "What are you doing here?" my aunt asked, narrowing her eyes like I was something she'd found stuck to the bottom of her shoe. "I was invited," I said simply. My uncle scoffed under his breath. "That must have been an error." Lindsay didn't speak. She just looked away, like if she didn't meet my gaze, she wouldn't have to deal with the reality of me. That was always her way: pretend, perform, disappear when things got uncomfortable. "No errors," Mr. Carson said as he stepped in behind them, a folder in his hand. "Everyone in this room was named in Harold Bennett's will." Silence. I didn't sit right away. I waited until the rest of them had taken their places, arranging themselves like royalty around the table, before sliding into a seat at the far end. It felt like a different world from the hospice room, this air-conditioned, well-lit formality. But I held onto the memory of Grandpa's hand in mine, the last squeeze, the quiet promise. Mr. Carson opened the folder. "I won't waste your time," he said. "This document was prepared and notarized in full accordance with your father's wishes. He was of sound mind and made no amendments in the final months. I'm here only to read what he left behind." I saw my aunt sit up straighter. My uncle smirked. Lindsay shifted like she was preparing for applause. "They had no idea." Mer Carson began. The first items were small, symbolic. A set of cufflinks passed to my uncle, a pearl brooch to my aunt for her style and stubbornness. Grandpa had written a stack of books to Lindsay's brother, who had once told Grandpa he hated reading. They were confused, restless. Their eyes darted to each other, searching for the real gifts. The money, the house, the assets that mattered. Then Mr. Carson paused. "There is one more section," he said, regarding the remainder of Mr. Bennett's estate. My aunt leaned forward. "The entirety of the primary estate, including the countryside property, personal investments, the art collection, and the account holdings in full, is to be transferred to Ms. Nora Bennett." I thought I misheard him. The room was so still it felt like time had slipped. My name echoed in my ears like thunder. Lindsay gasped. My uncle said something under his breath. "I won't repeat." My aunt, she went pale, all the color drained from her cheeks like someone had pulled a string. "What?" she said. No, that can't be right. There's more," Mr. Carson said. He unfolded a single handwritten letter, then looked up at me. He asked that I read this aloud. I nodded. Mer Carson's voice was soft but steady. "To the one who showed up when no one else did." I closed my eyes. "I leave what matters to the person who proved love is not an obligation, but a choice. Nor this world tried to make you small. I see you. I always did. Let this be the start of something better than what they offered you." When he finished reading, the silence in the room was louder than any argument. No one looked at me. They didn't have to. I wasn't angry. I wasn't gloating. I was just seen. For the first time, truly and undeniably, I had been seen. For a long moment, nobody moved. The only sound in the room was the slow, deliberate click of Mr. Carson folding the letter and placing it gently back into the folder. The paper whispered against itself like a secret finally told. I sat completely still, but my heart was pounding, not with fear or shame, but with something heavier, something deeper, something like justice. My aunt was the first to speak. "This is a mistake," she said, her voice tight and thin. "There's no way Harold would have." He wasn't thinking clearly. He was he was medicated. Confused. Double quotes. Mr. Carson didn't flinch. Your father was of sound mind when these decisions were made. He prepared the documents 6 months before his passing and reconfirmed them on record just for weeks before his final hospitalization. We have the audio files and witnesses if there's any question. My uncle leaned forward, lips curled into something almost cruel. He barely saw her. She was a visitor, a nice gesture, not a daughter. Asterisk, she was there, Mr. Carson said, calmly, when no one else was, daily, for hours. Your father noted it in his personal journal. I have copies, if you'd like. My breath caught at that he wrote about me. I hadn't known that. My chest tightened as the weight of it settled. In all those moments in that dim room, just him and me, soft words, softer silences, he remembered them. He wrote them down, while they were busy curating photo albums of their grief. He had been building something lasting, quiet and real. Lindsay looked like she'd swallowed glass. She opened her mouth, then closed it again. Her eyes met mine for just a second, and I saw something flicker there, confusion, maybe, or shame. But she said nothing. This isn't about punishment, Mr. Carson continued. It's about love. Your father didn't speak in anger when he finalized this. He was calm, grateful, clear. I wanted to disappear into the wallpaper. I didn't come here to be vindicated. I didn't want revenge. All I ever wanted was to be acknowledged, to be loved, openly, the way I had loved him. He always talked about the family estate as legacy. My aunt said sharply, are we supposed to believe his legacy is her? I felt the heat rise in my cheeks, but I stayed still. She's not even part of this family in any meaningful way, she went on. She wasn't raised with us. She wasn't in the traditions. She was barely around until the very end. I was there at the end, I said, my voice quiet but unwavering. When it mattered, the words hung in the air, undeniable. They all looked at me then, not as a nuisance or a forgotten cousin, but as a threat to their version of the truth. The silence stretched like a drawn bow. I didn't flinch. I met their eyes, one by one. You weren't there, I said, louder now. Not when he needed you. Not when he was scared or hurting or lonely. I read to him when he couldn't sleep. I fed him when he was too weak to lift a spoon. I held his hand the night he thought he was dying. He was my father, my aunt snapped, and he was my grandfather. I replied, and I showed up. She recoiled, her mouth pressed into a bitter line. Mr. Carson slid a new stack of papers toward me. These are the transfer documents. You're under no obligation to accept anything, but everything has been processed per his will. The house, the accounts, the assets, they're yours, effective immediately. I nodded, barely able to breathe. There was no applause, no grand moment of triumph, just a quiet settling, a shift, the story they'd tried to tell, the one where I was the outsider. The forgettable one was breaking apart in front of them. He had given me more than things. He had given me truth. I stood slowly, gathering my bag. The room felt smaller now, like it couldn't contain the truth that had just bloomed inside it. I didn't ask for this, I said softly, but I won't apologize for it. They said nothing. I turned to Mr. Carson. Thank you, he offered. A nod. He was proud of you, you know. The words caught me off guard. More than once, he added. He said you reminded him of the kind of person he wished he'd been if he hadn't been so afraid. My throat tightened. I couldn't speak. I walked past my family, my so-called family, without looking back. They'd chosen silence, exclusion, polished grief, but he had chosen me in a quiet room, with a failing heart, and all the time in the world stripped away. He had seen me and said yes. Yes to my presence. Yes to my love. Yes to my worth. And now, I had to decide what to do with it all. The inheritance, the house, the pieces of him he'd left behind. I didn't know yet, but I knew this. He made sure I would not be forgotten. And I wouldn't let myself be invisible again. It was a simple envelope, cream-colored, no return address. My name written on the front in his handwriting, the same loopy, slanted script I'd seen scribbled on crossword puzzles and grocery lists. Now suddenly so precious it hurt to look at. Carson had handed it to me after the others left. Quietly, like he was passing me something sacred. He asked that you open it alone. He'd said. So I waited. I carried it home like something fragile, pressed to my chest in the elevator. Laid it gently on my kitchen counter like it might shatter. I didn't even take off my coat. I just stood there, staring at it with trembling hands and a heart that felt far too full of things I hadn't named yet: grief, relief, disbelief, love. When I finally opened it, the first thing I noticed was the smell, faintly like old books and peppermint. Him. The letter wasn't long. just a single sheet of lined paper creased neatly down the middle. It began simply, like everything he did, my Nora. I sat down, my knees couldn't hold me. If you're reading this, then I've gone, and they've shown you what they're capable of. I wish I could say I was surprised, but I'm not. You and I both know how they operate: smiles for strangers, silence for the ones who need them most. I blinked through tears. I want you to understand something, clearly and without question. This isn't about revenge. It's about truth. You showed up, that's all it was, and that's everything. You came when no one asked you to, you stayed. When it was hard, you gave me something I didn't think I'd get before the end: peace, company, a reason to laugh again. You reminded me who I used to be, back before the world made me hard. I covered my mouth, holding in the sob that tried to escape. They made a show of family, but you gave me the real thing, and I couldn't let that go unacknowledged. Not when I had the power to do something about it, so yes. I left you the house, and the investments, and the art, though frankly, I think it's mostly overpriced junk. I laughed through my tears, but more than that, I hope I've given you permission to take up space, to live fully. To stop waiting for someone else to say, you matter, you do, you always did. They'll be angry, let them be. They were angry long before you ever had anything they wanted. You didn't steal this, you earned it. Every second by my side was a moment of love I never thought I'd get to feel again. If they come for you and they might, don't meet them with spite. Meet them with silence. You don't owe them a single word. Your life is yours now. Let it be soft where you want softness. Let it be strong where they wanted you small. There was a pause in the text. A break, a breath. Then the last lines. This world can be cruel to women who care too much and speak too little. But you, my girl, you saw me. And I see you. I always did. Go build something beautiful. You already started. Love, Grandpa. I didn't move for a long time after finishing the letter. I just sat there, clutching the paper to my chest, like a lifeline, sobbing in a way I hadn't let myself do since the night he died. Because now it was real. Not just the inheritance, not just the property or the accounts or the stunned expressions of the people who had tried to erase me. No, what was real, achingly, undeniably real, was the love. He'd seen my quiet care and decided it was worthy of recognition, not because he had to, not because someone told him it was polite, but because he wanted to, because he believed it mattered, because I mattered. The world had been telling me for years that I needed to shrink, that I was only lovable if I stayed convenient, quiet, small. Even in my own family, I had been the footnote, the background character. But in his final days, he had handed me something I didn't even know I needed: a mirror that showed me clearly. For the first time, I wasn't invisible, I was undeniable. And now, armed with his words and his unwavering belief in me, I could finally begin. Not to prove anything. Not to them, but for myself. For the girl who sat in a hospice room with a book in her lap and love in her chest. Who thought she was just keeping someone company but was actually building the foundation of something much greater. A life, a home, a beginning. The house was quiet when I walked through the door for the first time as its owner. Not the hollow quiet of abandonment, but something deeper, like the walls were waiting, like they knew I was coming. It was exactly as I remembered. The creak in the floorboard just past the entryway, the scent of old wood and faded cologne. The coat rack still leaning slightly to one side. I ran my fingers along the hallway table, where Grandpa used to toss his keys and that one brass coin he kept in his pocket for luck. Everything had the stillness of a place left mid-thought, a place paused, not forgotten. I set my bag down and stood in the middle of the living room. This had been his world, his sanctuary, the place he built piece by piece after retirement. Where he brewed his tea just so and arranged his books in perfectly uneven stacks. He once told me that a home should look lived in, not staged. Mess means you're alive, he said with a wink. Now it was mine. The others hadn't reached out, not one of them. No calls, no texts, not even a passive-aggressive email. And for the first time in my life, I wasn't waiting for their approval or their anger. I wasn't preparing an apology or bracing for their scorn. I was just here. It took me 2 weeks to unpack fully, not because I had that much stuff, but because I kept finding reasons to pause, to sit with a box of his letters, to flip through old photo albums tucked behind the bookshelf, to cry when I found the note he wrote in the margin of To Kill a Mockingbird, my favorite book, the one I read to him in his final month. It simply said, "Her voice is mine, keep reading." He had written those words for me. I started planting a small garden in the backyard, just like he used to talk about doing but never got around to. I pulled weeds with my bare hands, feeling the soil under my nails like an anchor to something honest. I planted freesia, of course, and lavender, and wild mint, because it reminded me of the tea he loved. There was something sacred about reclaiming that space, turning grief into growth, silence into sound, loss into legacy. I didn't know exactly what I was going to do with the money, the art, the investments. It still felt surreal, like I was living someone else's story, but every day, I took another step into it, into the life he believed I could build some days. I still felt that old ache, that old pull toward needing to be seen. I'd catch myself wondering what my mother would say if she knew I'd kept the house just as it was, or if Lindsay still told the story her way at parties. I'd wonder if they thought I gloated, or if they assumed I'd vanished, tucked away in the countryside with my silence and my so-called sentimentality. But then I'd hear his voice again. You don't owe them a single word. So I didn't speak of them. I spoke to him. I spoke to myself. I filled the house with music, with light, with the sound of my own laughter echoing in a space where, for once, I didn't have to apologize for taking up room. I hosted dinners for friends, real friends, the kind who don't flinch when you cry or tease when you stumble. I framed the letter he left me and hung it above my writing desk. I started writing, too, not for anyone else. Not yet, but just to remember, just to make something out of everything I'd been carrying. People like to say inheritance is about things, money, land, legacy. But my inheritance was this, the space to become, the validation I had been chasing all my life, finally handed to me, not through approval, but through recognition. Through love that didn't need to be earned. He saw me, and in doing so, he gave me permission to see myself, not as an afterthought, not as a mistake, but as the continuation of something strong, quiet, steady. Something worth passing on. One morning, I stood on the front porch with a mug of coffee, barefoot, the early sun warming the railing. The freesia had begun to bloom, delicate and defiant. The wind smelled like mint and new beginnings, and for the first time, I didn't feel like I was standing in someone else's home. I was exactly where I belonged,